actually important? So, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, nearly 1 in 10 U.S. kids are diagnosed with ADHD, making it the most common childhood diagnosis in the U.S. However, today I would like to present to you my proposition that ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is overdiagnosed. I will support this with 4 claims. 1. Symptoms of ADHD can be attributed to other things. 2. ADHD is not a biological disorder. 3. The diagnosis of ADHD is too subjective and broad. And 4. Scientific proof for the disorder has sometimes been purposely manipulated. So, for my first claim, that symptoms of ADHD can be attributed to other things, I have 3 points to support this. The first one comes from Roger H. Wright, a clinical psychologist, who states that attention deficit often happens when somebody is tired, especially if that person is under 5 years old, and can even happen to adults if they have been tired or stressed out for a long time. Thus, a major symptom of the disorder can simply be attributed to stress and fatigue. My second point also comes from Wright, as he points out that deficits in many areas, such as motor activities, reading and writing, amongst others, can cause hyperactivity and lack of focus, so often seen in ADHD diagnosed children. Thus, many children wind up being misdiagnosed and wrongfully medicated. My third point is that there has been a change in lifestyle for the average child due to new technology which contributes to the overdiagnosis. Sandy Tamimi, a child psychologist, points out that many children who are exposed to TV and computer games at a young age can develop a form of sensory addiction, which leads to lack of focus and concentration in less stimulating environments such as school. Also, researchers at the University of Washington have found a strong connection between the length of TV watching and attention span. Thus, many children simply do not have ADHD, but they are just understimulated at school and overstimulated at home by electronics. All 3 points suggest that symptoms of ADHD can be other things and do not always prove that a child has the disease. For my second claim that ADHD is not a biological disorder, I have 2 points to support this. My first point comes from psychologists Jonathan Leo and Jeffrey Cross, who state that normal children's response to stimulants is the same to that of children with ADHD. This is significant because a positive response to medication means that there is an actual disease. However, since there is no difference, it seems to suggest that ADHD is not a medical condition. Also, a doctor from the National Institute of Mental Health has confessed that there is no scientific proof for the disorder being an actual disorder. This means that there is no biological abnormality, and it can't be a biological disorder. My third claim is that the criteria for ADHD is too subjective and broad, which can lead to overdiagnosis. And I have 3 different points to prove this. According to Sylvia Schneider, a clinical psychologist, there aren't any biological tests for the diagnosis, leading the psychiatric diagnosis to be subjective. This means that there is no concrete medical test for ADHD which can lead to overdiagnosis, since there is no way to prove it scientifically. My second point comes from a research study done by Duke University, which found that the majority of children receiving stimulant treatment fell far below the threshold of an ADHD diagnosis. Also, Michigan State University found that nearly 1 million kindergarten students are misdiagnosed each year, and that younger children are more likely to be rated by their teachers as hyperactive. Dr. Robert Myers believes that this reflects the immaturity of the students rather than ADHD itself. It is very easy to call a child hyperactive, and this is why the disorder is the most common diagnosis for children. My fourth claim is that researchers sometimes manipulate their research to prove that ADHD is a neurological disorder, and I have 1 point to prove this. Dr. Swanson and Dr. Castellanos provided evidence that ADHD is an actual by showing that there is a connection between brain atrophy and the disorder. However, all the MRIs they looked at were from patients who had been treated with stimulants for the disease. Therefore, this proved that there is a connection between brain atrophy and ADHD medication, but it did not prove that there is a biological abnormality for ADHD. So, after presenting my evidence, I hope you will all agree with me that ADHD is overdiagnosed.
Again, I'm going to ask the time.
5 minutes and 35 seconds.
Thank you. All right, you clearly state the claim. There's a good layout of what the secondary structure is going to be. I think you need to develop what the consequence or the harm is a little bit more. In other words, why is it problematic if it is overdiagnosed? What potential consequences are there to kids if they get such a diagnosis? That would suggest the controversy a little bit more. On the individual signposting in the body of the speech, I thought your first point was labeled pretty clearly, but it got confusing because you had 3 or 4 supporting points under that point that were separate from the other 3 or 4 supporting points that you had for the body of the speech. And when we talked about how sometimes things get a little too structured in a short presentation, that was an example of that. So fortunately, I was able to pick out when you moved to the second major point that was in fact the second major point. So you probably want to do less numerical signposting on the minor claims and just give us the explanations on them. Generally, there was a lot of explanation. The proof on it seems sometimes a little bit thin. It's conclusionary in a couple of spots. We've got authorities who are offering their opinions on this. We don't get very good examples on some of the points. There are some general criticisms of the whole process of identifying people who have ADHD, and I thought that those were explained pretty well. That you had one statistic at one piece of information at one point that suggested 1 million kids a year being diagnosed at this level, and that sounds to me like at least 1 million doctor's visits for kids, and that seems like an awfully large number. So if you've got some way that you could double check that, I think that would be helpful. I'm not saying that it's not an accurate number, but when somebody says that some kid has ADHD, that might be 1 million kids get labeled that way by their teachers. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are being treated, and maybe that would be the one standard that we ought to be going by, the number of kids who are treated each year. Are we adding 1 million a year, or is it 1 million each year and that's the total and it stays roughly the same? That could be clarified a little bit. The presentation is a little problematic. I could barely hear the second part of your fourth claim when you were presenting it, and then during the speech sometimes your voice does drop out a little bit. You generally don't look at the audience, and I think that that's undermining your credibility. You've got good research in the body of the speech, but you're presenting it in a very tentative way, and this is a room where we've got a little bit of an issue with the blower here, and if I'm sitting up front and having trouble hearing it, although I'm an old guy and my hearing is probably a little impaired, I'll bet there's some people further back who are having some of the same problems. So you need to project a little bit more, Ashley. Thank you.